Hello friends, today's class will deal with a very important concept, that is barriers we experience in the process of communication. Communication is very important because it involves an exchange of information from one person to another. When there are barriers created, it means either I don't understand what you say, or you assume that I understood what you said, but in reality that hasn't happened. So as a result, there is no proper information exchange taking place. This could have several implications, especially if we are looking at a situation where an important bit of information needs to be passed on. There is a crisis, instructions have to be sent. In such situations, if there are barriers to communication, it would result in consequences that could even be fatal. So what are barriers? Barriers are obstructions or interference in the process of communication. So it could take the form of just about anything. There can be several kinds of barriers which result in ineffective communication. What do we mean when we say barriers? To understand what we mean when we say barriers in communication, one way of looking at it is from the perspective of the communication process. Communication process involves a sender, a receiver, a channel. Now, when we talk about barriers, barriers could be in terms of barriers at the receiver's end, barriers at the sender's end, or obstructions or interference in the channel, in the process, in the medium, which could also result in distortion. So, one way of understanding barriers in communication is to focus on where the problem starts or where the problem lies. Barriers can also be categorized in terms of where it originates from, that is, it could be a physical barrier, contextual barrier, or environmental barriers. When we talk about physical barriers, we are referring to the things which are physically present around us. Individual barriers refers to barriers related to the people in the context, be it the sender or the receiver. Environmental barriers deal with factors around us, that is probably the layout, the temperature, the ambient temperature, the time of the day, the kind of noise that is being generated in and around us. So, all these form part of environmental barriers. There is also something called contextual barriers, that is with respect to the situation in which a communication process is happening, a situation in which the communication is being delivered. So, that situation also has an effect. Let us assume we are passing on a message to someone in a crowded room versus we are passing on a message to someone in a very silent room where there are no other members. So, the context also determines how well or how effective the communication process is actually going to be. Any interference in the communication process is called noise. This noise in a communication process could take various forms. It could be visual, it could be olfactory, it could be auditory. What do we mean? A visual noise is a disturbance which we can see, a disturbance which diverts our attention because we are seeing something that is not integral to the message we wish to communicate. Let us assume you are talking to your friend and parallelly he or she is reading a newspaper. So, in that case, the newspaper is a visual noise that is created in the process of communication, verbal communication between you and your friend. Olfactory communication is in terms of smell, something very nice, something distracting, a smell which distracts our attention from the message that is being communicated, where we could either be a sender or a receiver. In both cases, when something related to smell is distracting us, it becomes an olfactory interference or an olfactory noise. An auditory noise is a noise where there is some sound actually, some sound which is interfering with the delivery of the message. Let us look at a situation where the teacher is teaching and suddenly the bell rings. What happens? The last few sentences that the teacher has spoken, probably most of the children fail to listen to that because there is a noise created, an auditory noise in terms of the ringing of the bell. So, noise can take various forms: olfactory, auditory or visual. Inattentiveness, which is created because of any of these reasons, would also contribute and become a barrier to effective communication. This is another way to look at the various barriers in communication. Barriers can be classified as physical barriers, cultural barriers, language or linguistic barriers, mode of communication, attitudinal barriers, perceptual barriers, emotional barriers, and so on and so forth. Let us pay some attention and look at each of these in detail. Physical barriers can be understood in terms of the time, the medium or the environment. What do we mean by physical barriers? Physical barriers, for example, a class taken at 9 a.m. in the morning versus the same class being conducted at 5:30 p.m. in the evening. Early in the morning, the energy levels of students are high and they are all full of attention. So, a class conducted at 9 a.m. probably would be more effective as compared to a class which is conducted at 5:30 in the evening, where after a long day at school, the children are already, their energy levels are flagging, their attention levels are flagging, and so the impact of the communication changes. So, what we mean is the time or the duration are two factors which can form barriers to effective communication. Physical barriers can also refer to things we see around physically, poor lighting or broken furniture or a blackboard which results in a squeaky noise whenever something is written on it. These are all various physical barriers which could interfere in the communication process. Let us look at an office layout. There is an office boy, a help in the office. Now, imagine two kinds of scenarios. In one case, it's a large expanse, a wide open kind of a space where someone calls him and tells him to do something. Imagine a different scenario. There's a corner office, a nice big cabin with a desk and a chair in the middle, and there's someone sitting behind the desk. He rings the bell, office boy comes in, and then he is told, please get that file. In the earlier situation also, there was a big room, but it's not one person sitting there. There are several cubicles, lot of people sharing space, and one of them calls the office boy and says, please get the file. The instruction given, the message communicated in both the situations is the same. But studies have shown that, as in the second case, where the physical environment conveys a status, in such cases the compliance to an instruction, that is acting upon the message that has been communicated, is much greater. So, the importance attached to the message in a communication process is now dependent on the physical cues in the environment. Thus, these could become barriers to effective communication. In both the cases, the message was the same, but when the same message is delivered by a person sitting in a large room, the assumption is here is a person of authority, here is a person of a higher status, and so the response to the message is better as compared to the other situation where you are one of the many asking for a file. So, physical barriers to communication could take one of these forms. We then look at another form of barriers to communication. These are the cultural barriers. Our world is a beautiful but a complex place. There are multiple differences on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, different cultures which coexist in this world. So, based on the culture you are from, based on the culture in a particular context, things could mean or could be interpreted differently. So, cultural situation could also become a barrier to effective communication. Let us consider a situation in the Indian context when say a woman comes across a group of people she has known before. What do we do generally in such a situation? Quickly we raise our hands, fold our hands and say Namaste. Namaste is a very common and accepted form of greeting in India, and it is also a show of respect. Now imagine the same person plucked out of India and put into a different context. Let us say a Western country, maybe in the US or in Europe. Now in the same situation, someone known walks up and offers to shake hands. Instead, the lady raises her hands and says Namaste. Now these actions can be interpreted totally differently based on the cultural context. The people may construe these actions as actually an insult, a slight to the other person. Here is a Westerner or a European who is offered to shake hands and the lady refused to shake hands. So, the act of saying Namaste may not be interpreted as a show of respect, instead it may be interpreted as an insult. So, the message you are trying to communicate, a greeting, is now colored by the cultural context. So, culture could also form a barrier to effective communication. Cultural differences need to be taken into account, especially when you are looking at communication in the international context or in the cross-cultural context. We will now discuss another very important kind of barriers, that is language barriers or linguistic differences. English is a common language which is spoken across most of the countries in the world. Still, the same language can be interpreted, spoken and mean different things to different people. For example, the word trunk. When you say trunk, it probably, what could it mean? In the context of American English, trunk refers to the storage space in a car, whereas for a Britisher, trunk is a piece of luggage and boot is the storage space in a car. So, the same word trunk carries different meanings in different contexts. So, within the same language, if the same word could mean different things, imagine the kind of distortion that could be possible if you are trying to communicate across languages. Linguistic differences play a very important part in affecting the communication process. For example, the word ice. we have 2 or 3 variations of that word probably in English: ice, snow, things like that. Now, if you see the language spoken in Iceland, Icelandic, there are more than 20 different words just to refer to the word ice or snow. So, the nuances of that word may be lost to us when we are trying to communicate something. When we take something from Icelandic and translate it into English. So, linguistic differences could become a barrier to effective communication. Variations in accent, dialect, the way a person communicates, these also could result in language related barriers cropping up in communication. Accent sometimes becomes a major stumbling block in the communication process. So, what happens when you are not very conversant with a particular accent? Take the example of, say, an Indian who has been educated in vernacular language, in the local language, watching an English movie. Now, in principle, the person may have been exposed to English language, but he or she may not be able to follow all the dialogues word to word when the movie is being shown. Instead, what would they do? They would probably guess what it means based on other cues such as the context, the body language, the non-verbal cues. So, what are we doing? Essentially filling in the gaps. So, language could become a barrier to effective communication process because the person is guessing rather than actually listening to what is being conveyed or listening to the message being conveyed because of a difference in accent. So, language in that way could also become a barrier to effective communication. Non-verbal cues, non-word messages, gestures, body language, the way we stand, the way we sit, the posture, these are all things which we assume are universal. But the message they convey, what does it imply, could mean different things in different contexts. It means different things to different people. If someone makes a loud noise after a full meal, it is considered to be very impolite in the Western context. But there are certain cultures where when a guest makes that kind of a sound, it is interpreted as a demonstration of satisfaction with the food that has been served. So, interpreting the non-verbal cues, interpreting the gestures, interpreting the body language within the context of the message becomes very important. Otherwise, they become barriers to effective communication process. So, today's class has focused on the various barriers to effective communication. Barriers could be understood in terms of the communication process, which means barriers could be at the end of the sender, the receiver, or barriers that crop up in the channel of communication. Barriers can also be understood from a different perspective, as in the kind of barriers. They could be physical barriers, they could be attitudinal barriers, emotional barriers, perceptual barriers, language related barriers, the communication mode also acting as a barrier. So, these are the several ways in which a communication can be distorted or a communication can be highly influenced by the barriers that creep into the communication process. The mode of communication also could become a barrier to effective communication. How so? Let us assume an instruction, give me a glass of water. Simple. Now, one possibility is saying, please give me a glass of water. The other is yelling, shouting and saying, "Give me a glass of water." In the second case, what is happening? The mode of communication is tinged with a different emotion. In the first case, it is a simple request, whereas in the second case, the receiver of the message may or may not act upon it. The receiver may feel, "Who the hell are you to yell at me? If you want a glass of water, go get it." So, the message and impact of communication process differs or changes when there is a difference in, or when there is an alteration in the mode of communication. When we are talking about mode of communication, we also need to remember that things like slang, colloquialism, jargon, these things are also going to become barriers to effective communication, especially if both the parties do not understand or do not figure out the implications of a particular word or a particular slang or a particular jargon. The other ways in which mode of communication could become a barrier is in terms of information overload, in terms of filtering, or in terms of selective perception. Let us look at each of these. Information overload happens when there is too much of information being conveyed through a message. When that happens, the receiver is unable to distinguish which part of the message is important and which part of the message adds on to or describes the key information. And because of that, the effectiveness of the communication is reduced. So, information overload becomes a barrier to effective communication. Filtering is another very commonly used method in communication process. What happens during filtering is the sender manipulates the information in such a way that he or she believes that it makes the communication more effective. But in reality, what happens? Because of filtering, information is lost and communication may not happen the way it is supposed to be. So, filtering, instead of enhancing communication, would actually become a barrier to effective communication. So, filtering happens at the sender's end. What happens if something similar is seen at the receiver's end? When it happens at the sender's end, it is called filtering. When it happens at the receiver's end, it is called selective perception. The receiver selectively perceives or focuses on, perceives only certain parts of the message which he or she believes to be important. So, what is happening in the process, in this bargain, some part of information is taken in and the rest is ignored or not paid attention to. So, selective perception becomes a barrier to effective communication. Selective perception can be caused due to multiple reasons, because of the prior knowledge of an individual, the environment, attitudes, cultural beliefs, a whole lot of other reasons which contribute to selective perception, both at the receiver's end or filtering at the sender's end. We will now look at attitudinal barriers in communication process. Attitudes are a way of looking at things, people, situations. So, attitude is a predisposition, or it is the way people tend to act in given situations. So, an attitude is a predisposition to act either in a positive or in a negative manner in a given situation and to a given message. Now, if a person has an attitude that all classes are boring, or whatever boss says is only meant to cause trouble. When people have these kind of attitudes, when a message is communicated, this tends to become a barrier to effective communication, because the focus is not on trying to grasp the essentials of the message being conveyed, or the focus is not on the information that is being communicated, but rather it is colored by the positive or negative feelings a person has towards the person or the situation. So, the impact of the message is lost because of attitudinal barriers. Perceptual barriers are another set of barriers where people tend to view things from their own perspective, from their own standpoint, from the way they see things. So, perceptual barriers are inbuilt into people. So, let us take an example. Let us assume it is somewhere around a time when you usually have your lunch, and you are sitting in the class and the teacher is explaining something and gives a statement, it is as red as, and asks the student to fill in the last bit. Now, as red as, if the person is experiencing hunger, the person would probably say as red as an apple. So, what is happening here? Perceiving the color red is dependent on how the person is seeing the color red at that particular point in time from his own viewpoint. It is colored, or it is governed by what he or she is feeling at that point in time. So, perceptual barriers to communication come up when a message is interpreted from an individual's standpoint rather than focusing on what actually goes into the message. Emotional barriers refer to the emotions that a person is going through at a particular point in time, at the point when he is delivering or receiving the message. If a person is angry, the way he or she would react to an instruction would be very different from the same message being given when the person is in a very, say, happy or jovial mood. So, the emotions of a person at a point in time govern the way a message is seen, heard and interpreted. So, emotional barriers could also crop up, and emotional barriers could also distort the communication process.